Florence suffocates in the middle of the 17th century, a city swollen with heat and dread, where every breath feels borrowed and every shadow clings too closely to the walls. The air hangs heavy with the sour sweetness of rotting linens and the thick scent of beeswax smeared by trembling monastic hands across wooden doorframes, a futile charm against a plague that advances like a silent tide. Narrow alleys shimmer beneath a feverish haze, and the city's heart beats in low, uneven thuds, as if stone and flesh share a single, gasping lung. By nightfall, the streets empty, lanterns are shuttered, and only the faint clatter of distant bells betrays that life still stubbornly lingers. Inside the cramped rooms of the city's scribes, where dust gathers in the creases of manuscripts and ink stains bloom like bruises, something shifts. The inkpots, simple clay vessels blackened by years of use, begin to darken further, not from shadow but from a kind of internal collapse. It feels as though the light inside them is dying, pulled into a dense, oily heart that gulps down every reflection. Scribes notice it first in silence, a thickening, a weight, a viscosity that has no rightful place in ink made only from soot and gall. And then, one night, as the city's muffled groans fade into an almost reverent stillness, the ink moves. It slides across the rim of the pot like a slow exhalation, gathering itself before trickling onto the parchment below. The quills remain untouched on the desks. No hand guides the movement. Yet the ink flows with purpose, leaving behind thin, deliberate strokes, letters forming names not of the dead, but of the breathing, those still seen in the markets only days earlier, those who laugh nervously behind shuttered windows, those who clutch at rosaries softened by too many prayers. The ink writes these names as if recalling them, as if retrieving them from a catalog unseen by mortal eyes. By the time dawn creeps in with its pale, ashen light, the letters begin to fade, dissolving slowly into the parchment until the page appears blank once more. Scribes awaken to find no trace of the night's quiet transgression. But the city knows. Under the doors of the named, always the named, dark, wet stains bloom across the stone thresholds. They gleam like oil, smell of burned bone and damp air trapped too long beneath the earth, and cling stubbornly to the cracks between stones no matter how fiercely they are scrubbed. Neighbors avert their eyes, priests whisper blessings too softly to believe in, mothers cross themselves twice instead of once. Florence tries to pretend nothing is happening, that the ink's strange hunger is merely exhaustion, coincidence, fear twisting the mind. But the city breathes differently now, more shallowly, as though listening, as though waiting. And somewhere in those shuttered rooms, the inkpots throb with a pulse not their own, preparing for whatever name they will claim next. Rumors hiss through Florence like heated air rising off sun-struck terracotta, curling around corners, slipping beneath shutters, and settling into every uneasy household. The plague has already taught people to fear breath, touch, and proximity, but now they fear words, especially the words produced by ink that no longer waits for a guiding hand. Neighbors cross the street when a scribe approaches, clutching shawls to their faces as though the man carries death in the folds of his sleeves. Mothers pull their children indoors at the mere sight of a quill tucked behind a belt. Even priests, who once blessed the scribes for preserving Florence's records, now murmur prayers under their breath and avoid meeting their eyes. It is not the plague that terrifies them most, but the idea that ink itself might be choosing who lives and who falls. Inside cramped Florentine homes, families speak in whispers about parchment that writes on its own. They describe hearing soft, dragging strokes in the middle of the night, the unmistakable scrape of ink across fiber, just before the candles gutter out as though smothered by an unseen hand. Some claim they found faint marks on their tables at dawn, as if something had practiced forming letters before vanishing into the grain. Others insist they heard the wooden beams of their ceilings groaning in the darkness, a deep, unnatural creak like timber bending under a weight not meant for mortal eyes. These sounds, sharp, sudden, and laden with dread, echo through the district long before the inkpots in the scribes' chambers come alive again. The scribes themselves feel the city's suspicion pressing against them like a tightening noose. They continue their work because to abandon it would be to admit fear, and fear, in Florence during the plague, is the most contagious contagion of all. Yet each night becomes more difficult. They light a single candle, careful not to allow the room to fall into full darkness, for the ink seems to crave shadow the way fire craves air. The thicker the darkness grows, the more urgently the ink begins to pulse, as though it feels opportunity drawing near. Many scribes report the same sensation, a faint vibration along the wooden desk, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The ink pot trembles with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as though responding to something beyond the walls, something calling to it from the suffocating streets. The scribes attempt to drown the trembling under the scratch of their quills, but the ink grows restless, creeping toward the parchment's edge like a living tide. They watch with wide eyes as the candle's flame bends ever so slightly toward the ink pot, as if drawn by a hidden current. Outside, Florence listens. The city seems to hold its breath each evening, waiting for the moment when the ink begins its silent labor, writing names no one dares to speak aloud. By the time dawn stains the rooftops a pale, exhausted gold, the scribes are left staring at blank sheets that should not be blank at all. And beneath the doors of the newly marked, fresh stains spread like bruises across the stone, dark, glistening, and smelling of something that does not belong to this world. In the monastery of San Marconi, where cold stone corridors swallow footsteps and candles tremble as though afraid of their own light, the monks attempt to impose order on the unnameable. They declare the strange ink-born writings a sign from above, insisting that the parchments themselves have been purified through prayer, sanctified by Latin murmurs that echo through the cloisters each dawn. But sanctity dissolves quickly into dread. The air inside the scriptorium grows thick and heavy, layered with a stench that clings to the robes of anyone who enters. It is a smell that defies ritual, dense, humid, and nauseating, as if wet skin were being boiled over an open flame, releasing a greasy vapor that sinks into the very grain of the wood. No hymn, no incense, no psalm can overwhelm it. The monks persist, their hands shaking as they trace protective symbols across the wooden tables, but they cannot ignore what the parchment reveals. The ink no longer writes simple names in the elegant strokes of trained scribes. It produces short, sharp marks, branching, crimson-tinged strokes that resemble the arterial patterns found beneath human skin. The lines spread outward with a disturbing precision, each one trailing toward a specific corner of Florence, pointing like a compass needle warped by an unseen magnetic pull. Every mark seems to map an invisible path, as though the ink is tracing the veins of the city itself, following lifelines toward their inevitable stopping points. At first, the monks attempt to interpret these markings as divine warnings or spiritual pathways, poring over them with theological fervor. But the longer they study the shapes, the less holy they seem. The strokes throb faintly in the candlelight, giving the illusion of movement, like living tissue pulsing in rhythm with a distant, subterranean heartbeat. The monks avert their eyes, unwilling to admit that the parchment appears to breathe when no one is looking. Fear hollows them from the inside. Their prayers grow frantic, and their voices crack as they recite verses meant to repel darkness. Yet they know these words were written long before ink learned to move on its own. By the time the sun sinks behind the hills, their resolve collapses. Exhausted, they gather every inkpot from the scriptorium, clutching the cold vessels to their chests as though handling diseased animals. They descend into the monastery's stone cellar, a damp chamber with walls that sweat and floorboards swollen from years of moisture. With trembling hands, they lock the inkpots inside heavy wooden cabinets and secure the doors with iron latches scarred by rust. It is a desperate gesture, born of superstition rather than faith. But night does not honor locks. As darkness spreads across Florence, the monastery grows eerily silent. The wind does not touch the cloisters. Rats scurry away from the cellar entrance. Even the candles seem reluctant to burn. Deep beneath the chapel, where the inkpots lie imprisoned, something begins to stir. A faint, Rhythmic tapping echoes inside the cabinets, soft at first, then more insistent, like fingernails drumming against wood. The monks press themselves against their cell doors, too terrified to investigate. They listen as the sound grows into a low, wet slosh, unmistakable and alive. When the first monk gathers enough courage to approach the cellar at dawn, he finds the stone steps slick beneath his feet. A thick, oily substance seeps from the crack beneath the locked door, glistening like fresh tar. It spreads in slow rivulets across the floor, carrying with it the same suffocating smell of boiled skin and damp bone. The monk staggers backward, clutching at his robe as the realization settles in. Whatever the ink has become, it does not require a scribe, a quill, or even a vessel to contain it. The ink pots may remain locked behind iron and wood, but the ink itself has slipped free, choosing its own path through the monastery with the deliberate patience of something that no longer needs permission to exist. And as the monks scramble to seal the cellar, smearing wax along the cracks and whispering prayers they scarcely believe, the dark fluid continues to ooze outward, slow, purposeful, and inexorable. Drawn toward the city, it has already begun to map in strokes that look far too much like veins. By the time the sun rises over Florence, the city hums with a new kind of fear, subtle, invisible, and yet unmistakable. The pattern emerges quietly at first. Every resident whose name had appeared on the vanished lines of self-writing parchment falls ill exactly 2 days after the resinous stain appears at their doorstep. It is not a slow, creeping sickness, but a sudden, strangling collapse of strength, as if their lungs and hearts had absorbed the same black, oily substance that now seems to pulse beneath the stones of the streets. Mothers clutch fevered children, merchants abandon stalls, and even the guards hesitate at the sight of those damp, dark patches clinging stubbornly to thresholds. Some try to scrub the stains, using sand, wine, or vinegar, but the marks only sink deeper into the stone, as if the city itself had become porous, imbibing the exhalations of the afflicted. Each attempt to erase the blackened smears yields nothing but more horror. The surfaces appear wetter, almost sweating, their texture like skin stretched tight over unseen bones. From the riverbanks of the Arno, an unearthly sound rises. It is not the human moan of someone in pain, nor the clatter of water against stone. It is a low, guttural murmur that resonates through the air like ink pooling beneath the skin of the city, deep and viscous, a sigh so vast it seems to encompass every alley, every roof tile, every shuttered window. Sailors and fishermen clutch their chests, claiming the sound crawls beneath their bones, vibrating in rhythm with the pulse of Florence itself. The noise is intermittent, rising and falling with a sickly cadence, as if the city itself breathes the same black, liquid ink that flows unseen beneath doors and along streets. The infected bear grotesque symptoms. Limbs become waxen, skin tightens unnaturally, and eyes grow glassy, reflecting a shimmer not from the world around them, but from the darkness seeping within. Those who survive the initial 2 days speak of dreams that are not their own, of seeing the ink twist in shapes that trace the veins of Florence as if the city were alive, and they its mere conduits. Some whisper of voices, faint at first, emerging from the stone itself, whispers that hum names in the same cursive, looping strokes that appeared on the parchments, now carried from beneath the streets like some dreadful choir of the dead. Even the city's infrastructure seems affected. Doors that had been bolted firmly swing open as if pushed by invisible hands. Fountains overflow with water tinged black, stagnant and cloying, carrying a scent of scorched marrow. Market squares grow eerily empty, the air thick with a metallic tang that settles on tongues and in nostrils, a taste that cannot be swallowed nor ignored. In the dim alleys near the Ponte Vecchio, puddles form that resemble spilled ink. Step into them, and the soles of shoes are blackened, leaving ghostly prints that vanish only hours later, yet still, somehow, trace the passage of unseen visitors. The scholars and priests convene in whispered urgency, poring over parchments and old chronicles in vain. There is no precedent for a plague that moves not through air or touch, but through names, marks, and the very substance of the city's stone. Attempts at exorcism fail. Bells toll in every parish, not to summon the faithful, but as warnings of an invisible contagion, a specter of ink and shadow threading through the lives of the living. At night, Florence seems to breathe blackly. Each inhalation of the warm, fetid air carries the scent of scorched ink and boiled flesh. The streets appear to pulse faintly, like veins visible under translucent skin, and anyone who dares walk them feels the sticky brush of something just beneath the surface. No corner is safe. No threshold immune. And the river murmurs endlessly, a voice of ink and stone, marking every step, every name, every life the city will claim next. The people whisper that the ink is not merely a curse, but a hungry witness, watching, recording, and claiming in ways no mortal plague ever could. Those who see the stains early enough may flee, yet the stains always follow, crawling beneath doors and around corners, leaving the air heavy with their presence, and the city itself awaiting the next names to be written in its invisible ledger. Driven to the brink of madness, the scribes convene in the gloom of their shuttered chambers, hands trembling over the stone jars that have become both their instruments and their tormentors. The ink, thick and viscous, sits like a tarry hard at the bottom of each vessel, gleaming under the flickering candlelight as though it pulses with a life of its own. In a frenzy, they decide there is only one way to end the curse. The ink must be cast into the Arno, surrendered to the river's flow, and perhaps washed from the world forever. They carry the jars through narrow, winding alleys, the scent of burnt marrow clinging to their skin and clothing, their breaths ragged and shallow, hearts drumming like distant bells of warning. The moment the first jar tips, the ink does not behave as the scribes hope. Instead of dissolving into the water, it stretches, a long, sinuous ribbon across the river's surface, undulating like a creature alive. It spreads in thin, claw-like fingers, black and glossy, reaching toward the stone embankments and the wooden piers, curling and recoiling as if tasting the river itself. Panic grips the scribes, but fear is useless. The river refuses to absorb what they thought they could destroy. They throw the remaining jars in succession, each spill forming a new strand, and soon the water is veined with long, writhing strokes that glint like wet obsidian under the pale light of dawn. By morning, the Arno at the city's edge is transformed. The once clear water is muddied and gray, carrying a filmy sheen that hints at something more than silt or ash. The river smells wrong, acrid, metallic, a subtle trace of decay mixed with the bone-like pungency of the ink. Fish float belly up in shallow channels, and in the narrow tributaries, dead pigeons drift silently, their feathers soaked and glistening with the black substance. Even the air is affected. A faint, lingering scent of ink permeates the bridges, filling the nostrils with a cloying bitterness that makes the tongue curl. The people gather hesitantly along the banks, whispers spreading like wildfire. Some claim they can see shapes in the ink, subtle undulations that form grotesque suggestions of faces or limbs before vanishing again in the river's slow current. Others swear the ink stretches like fingers, as if trying to climb the stone walls of the embankments, seeking to touch the city itself. Children are pulled away, weeping, their parents' hands shaking as the black surface seems almost to breathe, rippling with a dark life that should not exist. Scribes return to their ruined rooms, hollow-eyed and silent, each carrying a new terror in their memory, the realization that they have not destroyed the ink, only liberated it. The city becomes a theater of the impossible. Pigeons fall dead from rooftops, their tiny bodies soaked in the inky stench. Courtyards and alleyways near the river are slick with a thin residue, shiny and black, leaving the imprint of invisible fingers, trails that no one dares to touch. Even the moonlight seems repelled, casting only a sickly glow over the darkened water. Monks convene once more in San Marci, muttering prayers over the banks and sprinkling holy water in vain, but the river mocks them. The ink moves independently, curling around stones, weaving between reeds, sometimes condensing into small, globular droplets that tremble before bursting silently into more streaks. No exorcism, no ritual, no mass of burning herbs can alter its course. By nightfall, the river's surface is a tapestry of black lines and shapes, flowing slowly toward the heart of Florence. The city feels the presence of something new, alien yet intimately familiar, as though the ink carries the memory of every name, every mark, every stain that had passed through the scribe's hands. And somewhere, deep in the dark currents, the scribes hear, not with their ears but with the weight in their chests, the faint, deliberate pulse of the ink as it writes again, just out of reach, promising that what has been spilled cannot be forgotten and will return. As the pestilence begins to loosen its grip, Florence exhales with a fragile, trembling relief. The streets, once slick with filth and whispered fear, are now crowded with cautious steps, the stench of decay fading beneath the scent of bread baking in the ovens and the warm, damp smell of the Arno under the rising sun. Life returns slowly, with a tentative joy, but the city carries the memory of the darkness in every stone, every archway, every shuttered window. Yet in the emptied houses, the scribes' chambers, and the abandoned scriptoria, there is a peculiar absence that chills more than the fever ever did. The blackened ink jars have vanished as if they had never been. The walls are scarred only by faint shadows of their presence, and the air hangs with a quiet weight, the faint metallic tang of memory and marrow lingering where the ink once simmered. In one forgotten scriptorium, dusty and sealed by time, a single remnant survives, a sheet of parchment, brittle at the edges, curled as if recoiling from the sunlight. Under the morning rays, delicate lines emerge, so thin and subtle that they might be mistaken for cracks in the old paper, but upon closer inspection, they form intricate patterns, sprawling networks that resemble the veins of some vast, unseen organism. They twist and wend with a deliberate geometry, extending outward like arteries toward every corner of the city, mapping every alley, bridge, and courtyard as if the parchment itself remembered the flow of life and death. Along these faint tracks, names begin to appear, written in a trembling, almost imperceptible script that seems to breathe when one leans too close. Some names belong to those who survived the plague, faces still walking among the living, though forever marked by the memory of what came close. Other names belong to those whose passing was halted by fortune, mercy, or some inscrutable whim, hovering between the worlds of the living and the dead, their destinies teased and delayed as if the city itself decided who would linger and who would vanish. The ink, so long thought destroyed, has left its trace not on bodies, but on Florence itself, branding the city as one might mark a beast, each line a testament to its own secret will. The parchment whispers the city's history back to those who dare to look, the slow exhalation of each breath in the alleys, the damp thrum of rainwater through the cobbles, the faint, metallic taste of iron in the fountains. It is a map of survival, fear, and the quiet pulse of unseen forces, threading through the streets like a dark undercurrent, touching lives as invisibly as wind touches leaves. The living walk unaware atop a lattice of ink, their steps recorded in patterns that no eye had seen before, yet every movement is inscribed in the memory of that fragile paper. Even the scholars and monks who stumble upon the parchment cannot fully comprehend its design. Their hands hesitate above the fragile lines, and they feel a subtle vibration in the air, as though the city itself watches through the ink, its attention patient, deliberate, and unyielding. The black ribbons do not scream or writhe anymore. They wait, coiled in quiet potency, a record of what Florence has endured, of what it has claimed, and of what it refuses to release. And yet, there is a strange, almost perverse beauty in the revelation. The city, once hunted by pestilence and haunted by the black ink, now stands as a living archive, breathing with a memory not its own, carrying in its streets the fragile thread of lives it has chosen to spare. The ink's will, inscrutable and terrifying, has shifted, not to punish, but to observe, to mark, to keep Florence in a state of suspended reckoning. Those who survived can no longer walk freely, for even in sunlight, in the hum of daily life, the lines of the ink linger, silent, patient, and endlessly watchful, reminding the city that it has been written upon, and nothing that lives in its bounds is ever truly unmarked. Florence breathes, yes, but now with the weight of its own story etched invisibly beneath every stone, every bridge, every fleeting shadow, and in that weight, the survivors sense a terrible truth. The city has learned to carry lives as easily as it once carried death, and the ink, forever patient, waits to decide whose fate will next be traced in its hidden, black veins.